What if the fate of one of the greatest empires in history depended not on armies or kings but on a secret pact whispered in the shadows? And what if the rise of a dynasty that would dominate the Indian subcontinent for generations began not with glory, but with betrayal, exile, and a teacher's burning vow for revenge? This is the story of the Maurya Empire, the first great empire of India, where power, philosophy, and ruthless ambition collided to forge a dynasty that would stretch across vast lands and leave behind a legacy that still shapes the world today. At its heart lies a young man named Chandragupta, an unlikely warrior king. Guided by the brilliance and cunning of his mentor, together they would tear down ancient kingdoms, outwit rivals, and challenge the most powerful rulers of their time. But what began as a struggle for survival soon grew into a vision of uniting India under one Banara dream that would later reach its spiritual climax under Ashoka, whose transformation from a feared conqueror to a ruler of Dharma remains one of history's most dramatic turning points. Stay with us as we unravel secrets hidden in dusty chronicles, trace the footsteps of rebels who became emperors, and witness the battles and betrayals that shaped the destiny of millions. This is more than history, it is a story of ambition, vengeance, and redemption. And as you watch, ask yourself, what would you sacrifice for power, and what would you give up for peace? Join us now, and step into the untold saga of the Maurya Empire. The boy who would be king. The winds of Magadha carried with them the whispers of empire. But before palaces, before armies, before the thunder of war elephants shook the earth, there was only a boy abandoned, destitute, and forgotten by the very world he would one day rule. His name was Chandragupta, and his life began not in the grandeur of a royal court, but in the dust of obscurity. In the mid-4th century BCE, the Gangetic Plain was a chessboard of kingdoms. The most powerful among them was Magadha, ruled by the mighty Nanda dynasty. Their wealth was legendary, their armies vast, their coffers overflowing with gold, but their cruelty was equally infamous. The Nandas, though rich, were despised for their arrogance and oppression, and beneath their glittering throne, discontent simmered like molten lava waiting to erupt. It was into this fractured world that Chandragupta was born. Some say he was the illegitimate child of a Nanda prince and a low-born woman, abandoned out of shame and raised by hunters in the forests. Others believe he was merely a boy of humble birth, plucked from the masses by fate itself. Whatever the truth, his life was destined to cross paths with a man whose brilliance and fury would change history forever. Chanakya, known later as Kautilya or Vishnugupta, was not a man to be ignored. A Brahmin by birth, his sharp intellect and cutting tongue made him both revered and feared. He was a scholar, a strategist, and above all, a man who could not forgive insult. Legend says that when he once visited the court of the Nanda king, he was mocked for his unkempt appearance. The king's laughter was joined by courtiers, who jeered at his crooked teeth and wild hair. Humiliated, Chanakya swore a terrible oath. He would not rest until the Nanda dynasty was torn from its throne and its roots extinguished. It was this burning desire for vengeance that led Chanakya to search for a weapon, a human weapon through whom he could enact his revenge. He saw in Chandragupta what no one else had seen, the spark of destiny in the eyes of a neglected boy. Where others saw poverty, Chanakya saw potential. Where others saw weakness, he saw a vessel for greatness. Taking the boy under his wing, Chanakya became both mentor and father, shaping him with the iron discipline of a teacher who knew that one day this child would stand against kings. But before destiny could unfold, survival had to be earned. Chandragupta's early years under Chanakya were not spent in luxury, but in the wilderness. He learned to move like the tiger in the jungle, to strike like the serpent in the grass. He studied the Vedas, absorbed the wisdom of statecraft, and mastered the art of war. Every lesson carried the weight of a future not yet revealed. Patience, Chanakya would say. The earth is conquered not by rushing, but by striking at the right moment. Meanwhile, the world around them trembled. Far to the west, a storm had passed the armies of Alexander the Great, had thundered into India, crushing kingdoms and leaving behind chaos in their wake. Though Alexander himself would die young, his invasion fractured the northern kingdoms and left behind generals and satraps fighting for scraps of his empire. The land was ripe for conquest, but who would seize the chance? For Chandragupta, destiny's first test would come in the shadow of these foreign conquerors. With Chanakya's guidance, he dared to challenge even the remnants of Alexander's army, rallying small bands of men into a force that struck with speed and cunning. Stories spread of a youth who fought like no ordinary mortal, a leader who could inspire loyalty with his courage and fire with his words. Some whispered that the gods themselves had chosen him. But power never comes without peril. Each victory brought Chandragupta closer to the gaze of the Nanda dynasty, who ruled Magadha with fists of iron and suspicion. For Chanakya, this was the moment he had been waiting for. The boy was becoming a man, the spark of flame. Soon, the fire of rebellion would be ready to engulf the empire of the Nandas. And so the stage was set. A forgotten boy, molded by a vengeful scholar, was about to rise against the mightiest dynasty in India. Would he triumph, or would he be crushed beneath the weight of kings? Only time and blood would tell. The young Chandragupta was no longer the abandoned child of whispers. Under Chanakya's watchful eye, he had become sharp, quick, and ambitious. Yet, ambition alone could not unseat kings. To overthrow the Nanda dynasty, Chanakya knew they would need more than courage. They would need strategy, allies, and patience as cold as steel. Chanakya often reminded Chandragupta of the insult that had set everything into motion. "Never forget," he would say, his voice low and firm, "the laughter of the Nanda. Their pride is their weakness, and their weakness will be our weapon." The boy listened, storing each word like an arrow for a future quiver. For him, Chanakya was more than a teacher. He was the architect of fate itself. But the road to destiny first led west, to lands still echoing with the thunder of Alexander's conquests. When the Macedonian king had swept into India in 326 BC, his victories left behind fractured territories, ruled by satraps, foreign governors who controlled Indian soil but lacked loyalty to their people. For a time, their grip was strong, but after Alexander's sudden death, cracks appeared. His empire, like glass struck too hard, began to splinter. Chanakya saw opportunity in the chaos. "If you would be king of Magadha," he told Chandragupta, "you must first learn to defeat outsiders. Show the people of India that you can drive away the foreign yoke, and they will believe you can break the Nandas too." Chandragupta's first campaigns were not grand battles with elephants and chariots, but lightning strikes with small bands of men. He learned the art of guerrilla war, striking swiftly against Alexander's satraps, disrupting their supply lines, and melting back into the forests before retaliation could come. He was the shadow no one could pin down, the voice of rebellion spreading from village to village. Soon, stories of his daring began to travel faster than his own footsteps. Farmers whispered his name, merchants repeated his deeds, and soldiers deserted their masters to join his cause. In one telling, Chandragupta confronted Seleucus Nicator himself, the Macedonian general who later inherited part of Alexander's eastern dominion. Though the historical details are tangled, the essence remains. Chandragupta challenged the might of Alexander's successors and lived to tell the tale. That alone was enough to ignite the imagination of the people. Yet victories were fragile. More than once, Chandragupta's forces were beaten back, his men scattered, his dreams nearly crushed. But each defeat was a lesson, and Chanakya ensured those lessons cut deep. Power, Chanakya told him after one failed skirmish, is not only taken by the sword, it is taken by the mind. Do not fight battles you cannot win. Fight the battles that break your enemy's spirit. Meanwhile, the Nanda throne loomed ever larger. King Dhanananda, last of his line, sat in Pataliputra, the jewel of Magadha. His palace gleamed with riches, his vaults overflowed with treasure, and his armies were said to number in the hundreds of thousands. War elephants, chariots, cavalry, infantry, the Nanda war machine was unmatched. To dream of toppling it was madness. But madness, Chanakya believed, was often the mask of genius. Still, the boy had to grow into the man who could face such a giant. And fate, as always, tested him harshly. One story tells of Chandragupta and Chanakya wandering in disguise through the kingdom of Magadha. Hungry and weary, they found shelter with a poor woman. She fed them a simple meal of rice. But when Chandragupta, eager and careless, burned his hand trying to eat from the hot center of the dish, the woman scolded him. "Foolish boy," she said, "why do you attack the center of the rice first? One must eat from the edges before reaching the middle." Chanakya's eyes gleamed. To him, the woman's rebuke was no accident, but wisdom from the lips of the common folk. He turned to "Do you see? The Nandas sit at the center, heavily guarded. If we rush at them, we will burn. Instead, we must first seize the outer edges, the smaller kingdoms, until we can close in upon the center." It was the birth of a strategy, one that would redefine the political map of India. From that day, Chandragupta's campaigns changed focus. He turned his attention not on Magadha itself, but on the neighboring states, weak, divided, and resentful of Nanda domination. With Chanakya's cunning and Chandragupta's courage, they forged alliances, toppled petty kings, and gathered strength. Each victory was a stone laid in the foundation of empire, but for every kingdom that fell into his hands, a greater shadow loomed. The Nandas watched, their suspicion growing. Spies whispered of a young lion rising in the forests, guided by a Brahmin whose intellect was sharper than a blade. The throne of Pataliputra stirred uneasily. And so, the boy who had once been abandoned was now a threat to kings. The hunter had begun to stalk the elephant, yet still, the decisive clash had not come. That moment, when Chandragupta would finally challenge Dhanananda for the throne of Magadha, was drawing nearer with every step. The path forward would demand sacrifice, betrayal, and a gamble so immense that failure meant death. But for Chanakya and Chandragupta, there could be no turning back. The oath of vengeance still burned, and destiny would wait no longer. The boy was becoming the king the world had never expected. Breaking the elephant throne, the jeweled city of Pataliputra lay at the heart of Magadha, a glittering fortress of wealth and power. Its walls stretched for miles, its gates guarded by soldiers armed to the teeth, and its palaces bursting with gold. At its center sat Dhanananda, the last of his dynasty, a king who believed his throne was as immovable as the sacred mountains. Yet beyond those walls, in the villages and forests of India, rebellion was quietly spreading, carried on the whispers of a name that grew stronger with every passing season: Chandragupta. But before Chandragupta could even dream of storming Pataliputra, he had to contend with the sheer magnitude of Nanda power. The Nanda army was unlike anything the subcontinent had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of infantry, thousands of cavalry, and war elephants, so numerous that they blotted out the horizon when they marched. It was said that when the Nanda host moved, the earth trembled beneath their feet. Against such a force, the dream of rebellion seemed laughable. And yet, Chanakya reminded his protege of a truth he had once sworn by. The strength of the elephant lies not in its size, but in the weakness of its keeper. Find that weakness, and the mightiest beast will kneel. Chanakya's first step was not war, but intrigue. He wove a web of spies across Magadha, bribing courtiers, persuading ministers, and listening at the cracks of palace walls. Information was power, and every secret pried loose from Pataliputra was another weapon placed in Chandragupta's hand. It was here that Chanakya's brilliance shone brightest. Where Chandragupta was the sword, Chanakya was the mind, always 2 steps ahead, predicting the king's moves before they were made. The Brahmin also understood that no empire falls by force alone, it collapses from within. And so he whispered to the neighboring rulers of the Gangetic plain, reminding them of the Nandas' arrogance and oppression. Small kingdoms like Kalinga, Kosala, and Avanti had long suffered under the heavy hand of Magadha's taxation and domination. Now, they saw hope in Chandragupta's rising star. One by one, alliances formed, until a coalition of resentment stood behind the boy who had once been nothing. Still, war was inevitable. The Nandas could not ignore the growing storm. Skirmishes broke out across the borders of Magadha. Chandragupta's forces struck with speed, avoiding open battle, preferring ambushes and sudden raids that bled the Nanda army dry. Farmers fed his soldiers, villagers hid them in forests, and the oppressed rallied to his banner. Slowly, like a river carving stone, the invincible image of the Nandas began to crack. But destiny demanded more than guerrilla raids. The decisive confrontation was coming, and all of India seemed to hold its breath. The first true clash came near the plains of the Ganges, where Chandragupta's smaller force faced a Nanda detachment sent to crush him once and for all. Outnumbered, Chandragupta might have faltered, but Chanakya had taught him the value of patience and cunning. At dawn, Chandragupta's men attacked swiftly, then feigned retreat. The Nanda soldiers, arrogant and overconfident, pursued in disorder, only to find themselves encircled. The trap snapped shut, and for the first time a Nanda army was annihilated. The story spread like wildfire. The boy king had humbled Magadha's might. The victory was intoxicating. But Chanakya was quick to temper his protege. Do not mistake a single triumph for conquest, he warned. The Nandas are wounded, not slain. A wounded beast is most dangerous when it fears its end. Inside Pataliputra, paranoia reigned. Dhanananda raged at his ministers, accusing them of betrayal, executing generals, and taxing his people more heavily than ever to raise fresh armies. but each act of cruelty only pushed more subjects into Chandragupta's camp. The dynasty that had seemed unshakable was now rotting from within. Even as Chandragupta's star rose higher, and then came the boldest stroke. With his alliances secure and his armies swelling, Chandragupta marched toward Pataliputra itself, the jewel of the Ganges Valley, defended by walls of stone and rivers on both sides, stood as the final test. To challenge it was to risk everything. Victory would make him emperor. Defeat would erase his name forever. The siege of Pataliputra was unlike any battle Chandragupta had fought before. Nanda war elephants thundered against his lines, their tusks armored, their backs bristling with archers. Chandragupta's men met them with fire, drums, and spears tipped with poison, turning the beasts into chaos. On the walls, Nanda archers rained arrows, but Chanakya's spies inside the city spread confusion, sabotaging supplies and sowing mistrust. Day after day, the clash echoed across the plains, until the great city itself seemed to tremble on the brink. Finally, after months of struggle, the walls of Pataliputra were breached. Nanda soldiers, once proud, broke under the weight of rebellion. Dhanananda fled, some say with nothing but a few treasures, others say he was captured and killed. Whatever his end, the dynasty that had ruled Magadha with arrogance was no more. When Chandragupta entered Pataliputra, he was not the boy abandoned in the forests, nor the rebels striking in the shadows. He was Maharaja, emperor of Magadha, and the founder of the Maurya dynasty. Beside him stood Chanakya, the vengeful Brahmin, whose oath had been fulfilled. Together, they had toppled the greatest power in India and laid the foundation for an empire that would rival any in the ancient world. Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. The empire was vast, its enemies many, and the ghosts of Alexander's world still haunted the west. Chandragupta had seized the throne, but to keep it, he would need to face powers far greater than Dhanananda. The true test of empire was yet to come. The boy had become king. Now he would have to become emperor. Clash with the west. The throne of Magadha was won, but to keep it was another matter. Chandragupta now sat in Pataliputra, master of the richest city in India, but beyond its walls the subcontinent was still divided, suspicious and restless. Kingdoms that had pledged allegiance during the rebellion now watched closely, wondering if the young king could hold his fragile crown. And looming to the west was an even greater shadow, the empire of Alexander the Great's successors. Though Alexander himself was long dead, his legacy still lived in the fractured dominions of his generals. The satraps left behind in northwestern India had claimed Alexander's mantle for themselves, carving out territories with their Greek and Macedonian troops. Among them, Seleucus Nicator was the most ambitious. As one of Alexander's generals, he now sought to build his own empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus. His eyes turned eastward, toward the lands Chandragupta had just conquered. Chanakya understood the danger better than anyone. A throne gained by war, he told Chandragupta, is always threatened by more war. If you do not strike first, the West will strike you. But there was more than caution in his words. There was also vision. Chanakya did not see Magadha as the end, but as the beginning of a united Indian empire strong enough to resist any foreign power. So Chandragupta prepared for the inevitable clash. He expanded his armies, organized his administration, and tightened his grip on the Gangetic plain. Under Chanakya's guidance, the Arthashastra manual of statecraft, espionage, and ruthless pragmatism took shape, laying down the laws of empire. Spies were everywhere, markets were regulated, taxes were systematized, and justice was harsh but precise. India had never seen such order, and it was this order that gave Chandragupta the strength to look outward. The confrontation came around 305 BCE, when Seleucus marched east with a formidable force. He had fought wars across Asia, faced enemies as fierce as Persians and Greeks, and now believed that India, fractured and newly conquered, would be an easy prize. But he underestimated the man who waited for him on the other side of the Indus. The battles between Chandragupta and Seleucus are lost to history in detail, but their outcome is clear. The Maurya army, vast and disciplined, clashed with the Greek phalanxes and war-hardened cavalry in a struggle that shook the frontier. Indian war elephants, towering and unstoppable, charged against Seleucus men, scattering their formations. Where Greek discipline had once triumphed, it faltered against the thunder of beasts bred for war. Some accounts suggest the war dragged on, with neither side able to claim decisive victory at first. Seleucus, pragmatic as ever, realized that continuing the fight would drain his strength, and Chandragupta, though victorious in battle, understood that war with the West could consume his empire before it was even secure. The two rulers chose negotiation over endless bloodshed. The treaty that followed was not merely peace, it was triumph. Seleucus ceded vast territories to Chandragupta, including regions that stretched into modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Persia. In return, Chandragupta gifted Seleucus hundreds of war elephants, beasts that would later decide battles in the Mediterranean. The Maurya Empire had not only defended itself, it had expanded westward, absorbing lands once held by Alexander himself, to seal the alliance. Seleucus even sent his daughter in marriage to Chandragupta, a union that symbolized the meeting of two worlds, Greek and Indian, West and East. With this treaty, Chandragupta was no longer just a king of Magadha. He was the ruler of an empire that stretched farther than any Indian dynasty before him. But peace with the West did not mean peace at home. With the empire growing vast, Chandragupta now faced the challenge of governing millions of subjects across countless cultures, languages, and traditions. Chanakya's administrative genius was put to the test. Provinces were divided, and governors appointed, revenue systems established, and armies stationed to keep order. Roads and trade routes flourished, connecting India in ways that had never been connected before. Yet, amid all the triumph, there was unease in the emperor's heart. Power was intoxicating, but it was also exhausting. The weight of ruling such a vast land pressed heavily on Chandragupta, who had once been a boy running wild in forests, dreaming only of survival. Now, he commanded armies greater than Alexander's, and yet, he felt the price of ambition. It was during these years that legends tell of Chandragupta's encounter with Jain monks. Drawn to their teachings of renunciation and non-violence, he began to see another path beyond the endless cycle of conquest and rule. As his empire reached its zenith, the king began to wonder, was victory enough, or was there something greater than empire itself? But that question would not yet be answered. For now, Chandragupta stood as the unchallenged master of India, a conqueror who had humbled the West and united the subcontinent. His name echoed from the Indus to the Ganges, from the Himalayas to the Deccan. Still, destiny had one more chapter for him, and for his bloodline. The foundations he laid would pave the way for his grandson Ashoka to take the Maurya Empire to heights never seen before, and to transform it not only with power, but with a vision of Dharma that would echo across the centuries. The boy had become king. The king had become emperor. But what of the emperor who longed to be free? That story was yet to unfold. Asterisk. The rise of Ashoka Maurya Empire, carved from rebellion and conquest, now stretched farther than any Indian kingdom before it. Under Chandragupta, the Nandas had fallen, Seleucus had been humbled, and the western frontier secured. Yet empire, like a living creature, must constantly be fed with discipline, with ambition, and sometimes with blood. Chandragupta, weary from years of war and rule, chose a path no one could have foreseen. He abdicated his throne, handing the empire to his son Bindusara, and turned his back on power itself. Guided by Jain ascetics, Chandragupta renounced the riches of the world. The chronicles tell us that he journeyed south to Sravanabelagola, where he fasted unto death in the austere embrace of spiritual release. The man who had once stood toe-to-toe with Alexander's successors died in silence. His empire left behind as his true legacy. The new emperor inherited not just land and armies, but the immense challenge of holding together a realm that spanned deserts, mountains, and jungles. Called Amitragata, the slayer of foes, Bindusara extended Maurya control even farther south, into the Deccan. His reign was strong, but it lacked the legendary brilliance of his father's rise. He was a maintainer, not a founder. Yet Bindusara's true importance lay not in his conquests, but in the heir he would leave behind. Bindusara's many sons was one who stood apart. His birth was shrouded in mixed omens. Some claimed his mother was of relatively humble origin, not a queen of high blood, and thus he was not favored in the line of succession. Others whispered that astrologers foresaw greatness in him, but also a streak of violence that would one day drench the land in blood. As a boy, Ashoka was intelligent, restless, and ambitious. He was not content to remain in the shadow of his brothers. Trained in statecraft and war, he quickly gained a reputation for ruthlessness in battle. One tale speaks of his campaign against a rebellious city in Takshashila, where he crushed the uprising with merciless efficiency. Another describes him quelling unrest with such ferocity that courtiers began to fear his hunger for power. Yet Binja, recognizing both the danger and potential of his son, appointed Ashoka as governor of Ujjaina, key center of trade and culture. It was here, in this ancient city, that Ashoka's life began to change. While suppressing another revolt, he was injured and nursed back to health by a woman named Devi, the daughter of a merchant. Their bond grew, and she became his first wife, planting in him the first seeds of compassion that would one day blossom into something far greater. But compassion was not yet the face Ashoka showed to the world. When Binjasara died, the empire was thrown into turmoil. Multiple sons vied for the throne, and succession was far from certain. The struggle that followed was brutal, a silent war fought within palace walls and on the bloodied fields of succession. Some accounts suggest Ashoka killed his brothers, perhaps as many as 99 of them, to seize the throne. Whether myth or truth, the image endured: Ashoka the ruthless, the blood-stained prince who would stop at nothing to become emperor. And so, Ashoka ascended the throne of the Maurya Empire, his hands already tainted by blood. At first, he was feared rather than loved. He ruled with an iron grip, determined to prove himself worthy of the vast inheritance left by Chandragupta. His generals marched south, expanding the empire's borders. His ministers enforced order with harsh penalties, and his spies kept the nobility in check. To the outside world, Ashoka appeared every bit the conqueror king his grandfather had been. But fate had one more test in store for him, a crucible, a fire that would transform his very soul. For if Chandragupta's legacy was rebellion, and Binjasara's was consolidation, Ashoka's would be conquest, and then, something even more unexpected. That test would come in the form of Kalinga. Kalinga, lying on the eastern coast of India, was a proud and independent kingdom, rich in trade and culture. It had never bowed to Magadha, and its independence was a thorn in the side of every Maurya ruler. For Ashoka, newly enthroned and eager to secure his legacy, the conquest of Kalinga became an obsession. To subdue Kalinga was to complete the unification of India. To leave it free was to leave a challenge to Maurya supremacy. The drums of war began to beat. Across the empire, soldiers gathered, elephants were armed, chariots prepared, and banners raised. The people of Kalinga, proud and determined, met the challenge with equal resolve. They would not surrender their freedom without a fight. And so the stage was set for one of the bloodiest wars in Indian history, a war that would shake Ashoka to his very core, and turn the conqueror into something the world had never seen before. The Emperor of Iron was about to meet the battle that would break his heart and give birth to his Dharma. Ashoka's Dharma, the march to Kalinga, was unlike any campaign the Mauryan armies had ever undertaken. It was not simply another conquest, it was the last great test of Ashoka's will and the empire's might. For Kalinga was no weak, crumbling kingdom. It was a thriving, fiercely independent state on the eastern coast, proud of its freedom, wealthy through its seaports, and hardened by the knowledge that resisting Magadha was both peril and honor. As the Maurya host advanced, the ground shook beneath the weight of elephants. The sky darkened with the banners of countless divisions, and villages emptied before the approaching storm. Ashoka led them himself, determined that this conquest would be the crown jewel of his reign. To rule Kalinga was to rule all of India. To leave it unconquered was to leave a shadow over his throne. The battle that followed was ferocious. Kalinga's warriors fought with unmatched resolve, their archers loosing arrows from the hills, their soldiers charging with a desperation born of defending their homeland. But the Maurya war machine was too vast, too disciplined, too relentless. Ashoka's generals pressed forward, his elephants crushed through enemy ranks, and his infantry drowned the resistance in wave after wave. When the dust finally settled, Kalinga lay shattered. Its fields were littered with corpses, its rivers ran red, its people broken. Ashoka stood victorious, yet as he walked the battlefield, surveying the ruin he had wrought, something within him began to crack. The chronicles describe what he saw: 100,000 dead, 150,000 carried off into slavery, countless others wounded and weeping. Mothers screamed over the bodies of their children. Old men stared blankly at the smoldering ruins of their homes. Survivors cursed the conqueror whose triumph was their ruin. And in that moment, the emperor's heart, once so hardened by ambition and blood, was pierced by the weight of his own deeds. Ashoka had killed to win a throne. He had slain to secure an empire. But now, for the first time, he saw conquest not as glory, but as horror. The great victory of Kalinga was also his greatest defeat, not of armies, but of his soul. That night, as fires burned across the ruined land, Ashoka could not sleep. The cries of the dying haunted him. The faces of widows and orphans seared into his memory. He asked himself questions he had never dared before. What was the purpose of empire, if it brought only suffering? What was the meaning of victory, if it left nothing but ashes? It was then that Ashoka encountered the teachings of the Buddha. Whether through monks wandering the land or through his own searching heart, he found in Buddhism a vision of peace, compassion, and Dharma truth that resonated with his torment. Where once he had embraced the sword, he now turned to the path of the Dharma. The transformation was astonishing. Ashoka, the ruthless conqueror, became Ashoka, the compassionate. He declared an end to wars of expansion. No longer would blood secure his empire now. It would be governed by righteousness, by justice, by the welfare of his people. The Kalinga War, once his greatest triumph, became the wound that remade him. Across the empire, his new vision spread. Ashoka ordered the carving of edicts into stone pillars and rocks, inscriptions that survive even today. In them, he spoke not of conquest by arms, but of conquest by Dharma. He urged tolerance among faiths, compassion toward animals, care for the poor, and kindness to prisoners. Roads were built, wells dug, hospitals founded not for kings or nobles, but for ordinary men and women. His words reached far beyond his borders, sent to Sri Lanka, to Central Asia, even to the Hellenistic kingdoms of the West. Yet Ashoka's transformation was not without cost. The empire, once fueled by relentless expansion, now stood still. For some, this new vision was weakness, a departure from the warrior spirit that had built the Maurya throne. But for Ashoka it was strength beyond measure, the power to rule not by fear, but by the hearts of his people. The final years of his reign were marked by this devotion to Dharma. He became the beloved of the gods, a king who ruled not with the lash of tyranny, but with the embrace of compassion. Under his rule, the Maurya Empire reached its greatest extent, not just in territory, but in spirit. His message outlived his dynasty, echoing across centuries, carried by monks, travelers, and pilgrims. Even long after the empire itself faded, Ashoka's name endured, his wheel of Dharma later becoming the very symbol of India itself. But no story of empire ends without shadows. After Ashoka's death, the Maurya dynasty began to crumble, torn by weak successors and external pressures. Within 50 years, the vast dominion that Chandragupta had built and Ashoka had sanctified dissolved into smaller kingdoms once more. The empire was gone, but its legacy remained. The Maurya story is not merely the tale of kings and conquests. It is the story of a boy abandoned who became a king, of a teacher's vengeance that reshaped the destiny of a continent, and of an emperor who turned from blood to Dharma. It is a reminder that power can build, destroy, and transform. That history is not just the march of armies, but the evolution of the human spirit. And so, from Chandragupta's rebellion to Ashoka's Dharma, the Maurya Empire lives on not in palaces of stone or thrones of gold, but in the eternal question it leaves behind: is true greatness found in conquering the world or in conquering oneself?